Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib is facing a lot of criticism for flying the Palestinian flag outside of her office at the Capitol. Tlaib is of Palestinian descent, and reportedly the flag's been there for several months.
Now, reports say a Republican congressman has proposed a new measure to ban any flag other than the U.S. flag from being displayed at the Capitol building. Is that true? And would that actually be legal?
Well, the issue here is obviously the First Amendment, which prevents the government from restricting free speech, with speech meaning much more than just verbal words, but also symbolic expressions.
For example, the Supreme Court very famously and very contentiously ruled in this case that burning the American flag was protected free speech. So regardless of how you might feel about it, actually banning another country's flag from inside a government building would likely violate the First Amendment.
But headlines about this proposed measure are actually getting it all wrong.
Shocking.
The measure isn't actually trying to ban the display of flags outright. What it actually does is ban the use of tax dollars to buy flags from other countries. The congressman behind this measure obviously knew that the First Amendment wouldn't allow this kind of outright ban. So he targeted the funds behind it instead. This is a common, crafty loophole to get around the First Amendment protections.
And to avoid boring the pants literally right off your ass with a complex legal analysis, we'll just say this can sometimes work.
But of course, Tlaib herself could get around this by just buying the flag with her own money.
Sheriff in Florida went viral for saying this about shooting people breaking into your home.
We don't know which homeowner shot at him. I guess they think that they did something wrong, which they did not. If somebody's breaking in your house, you're more than welcome to shoot them in Santa Rosa County. We prefer that you do, actually.
So what happened here is that this upstanding citizen, with numerous prior felonies and status as a high-risk sex offender, was breaking into multiple homes in a neighborhood.
One of the homeowners shot at him, but he wasn't hit, and police didn't know which homeowner actually did it.
So whoever that was, you're not in trouble. Come see us. We have a gun safety class we put on every other Saturday. And if you take that, you'll shoot a lot better, and hopefully you'll save the taxpayers money.
This press conference was wildly criticized by defense attorneys throughout Florida. But was the sheriff actually right about the law? Well, Florida, like about half of all U.S. states, has what's called the Castle Doctrine. And the main point here is to offer greater legal protections to those who use deadly force inside their home.
But many people still don't quite understand what this law actually means. And it's super important to be specific here. To use deadly force, you must reasonably believe that you're facing imminent and serious harm.
What the Castle Doctrine does is legally presume that if someone's breaking into your home, your belief of harm is reasonable, meaning the use of deadly force is legally justified.
But this is just a presumption, not an automatic rule. Presumptions can always be refuted. For example, if the little kid neighbor from next door mistakenly comes into your house because they, thought their dog went through your dog door, it would not be legal to shoot them, thank God.
But the Castle Doctrine's presumption is still very powerful. Whenever someone does shoot a home intruder in Florida, any evidentiary disputes or questions have to fall in favor of that homeowner, and the presumption that their use of force was justified.
Talk about war crimes, and if they actually mean anything legally.
With the war between Ukraine and Russia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, and now Israel and Hamas, human tragedy is everywhere, and so are war crimes.
But the reality is, calling something a war crime is mostly just symbolic. The vast majority of the time, nothing actually happens to you if you commit one.
While there are tons of treaties that countries all over the world have agreed to that govern the rules of war, if you break one of those rules, nothing actually happens to you. Unless your own country agrees to prosecute you or turn you over to the International Criminal Court.
Which is a real thing.
Or your nation loses a war, is overtaken by a new power who then prosecutes you.
To use an example, let's say China goes to war with Australia.
Probably shouldn't even put that in the universe right now.
And at some point, Chinese soldiers commit a heinous war crime.
Well, China itself would have to prosecute their own soldiers or send them to the ICC, which is highly unlikely as China doesn't recognize the authority of the ICC anyway.
Neither does the US, by the way.
Or Australia would have to overtake China, act as the new governing power, and then prosecute them.
This last option is basically what happened in the famous Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were prosecuted and many sentenced to death. This only happened because the Allies won the war and assumed power over Germany.
That said, there are of course still reasons for international rules of war to exist. They can act as deterrents. If a country continues to violate rules of war that everyone's agreed on, other countries might stop supporting them or trading with them.
So think of rules of war as more like a social contract than actual law. Guys in Chicago robbed a postal worker at gunpoint and likely don't know how much they just screwed up.
So by robbing a postal worker, a federal employee, these guys committed a federal crime.
Which will be investigated by these badass motherfuckers. We'll get to them in a second.
First, what even is the difference between a federal and a state crime? And why should criminals even care?
Well, there are actually two different versions of most crimes. A state version and a federal version. Here's federal robbery and here's Illinois robbery.
That's because we have a federalist government, meaning that there are always two different powers of the federal government and each state's government.
Each can technically come after your ass, but the feds can only bring charges if your crimes involve the federal government in some way. For example, crimes that occur across state lines, on airplanes, or against federal employees or property.
If these guys in the video just robbed some random citizen, only state charges would have applied. But since he was a postal worker, the feds can step in. And that is very bad news for them.
Ever heard the expression, don't make a federal case out of it? The federal government has tons of resources and really talented prosecutors. As a result, they almost always win their cases. Data says they win 95% of them.
Punishments are also usually more extreme for federal crimes.
As for these guys, you might not have ever heard of them, but the federal postal inspectors are a branch of federal law enforcement, and they're known as some of the best and hardest working investigators.
They have the authority to enforce any law even remotely related to the mail. So maybe don't mess with U.S. mail.
California is at the center of a new controversy with its Ebony Alert system.
The governor just signed into law this new alert system made solely for missing black children and young adults. Similar to the Amber Alert system that you've likely heard of, Ebony Alerts will also allow the state to trigger emergency notifications on phone and road signs.
The new system has a lot of critics, with many saying that the new system's unnecessary because Amber Alerts obviously cover missing children of all races. And by giving a single race their own alert system, the whole thing's unconstitutional anyway.
But proponents say that the new alerts are necessary, pointing to data showing that there are much higher proportions of missing black children than any other race, and arguing that missing black girls don't get as much attention from the media. The bill's author has specifically criticized the amount of news coverage that was given to the missing persons case of Gabby Petito, who was a white woman.
But returning to the law, are these Ebony Alerts actually constitutional? Our very fancy lawyer analysis says it depends. That'll be $2,000.
It's important to understand that whether something's constitutional or not depends on what a court has to say about it. Although it's usually unconstitutional for the government to only do things that help or harm certain races, there's an exception if it passes strict scrutiny.
Which might sound like Ashley's constant attitude around me, but it's really just a legal standard that says a race-specific policy is constitutional if it helps to fix racial discrimination in an important area without being too broad and where there are no decent race-neutral alternatives.
Crystal clear, right?
No.
This is a super ambiguous standard, so it can be really hard to know how a court's going to rule on this. For example, affirmative action used to be constitutional because courts ruled that it passed strict scrutiny. Then it was overturned earlier this year because the court said it no longer did.
Another super viral video involving the police in a vroom vroom machine.
A motorcycle.
So the officer here cuts off the biker to pull him over.
I was pulling out of the road. What?
He immediately handcuffs him and pulls him off the bike.
What did I do? You're not gonna say anything? Up off the bike. What was I doing?
And then proceeds to search him.
How do you go over this?
Was this legal?
Well, the answer to that depends entirely on what the biker was pulled over for.
There's a lot of controversy in the comments about that. But using her super fancy Harvard lawyer analytics technology,
Turning up the sound.
the officer says you were going 100. The original video also mentions that the speed limit was 65.
In Florida, where this happened, driving 30 miles per hour over the speed limit can actually be considered reckless driving, which is a misdemeanor punishable by up to 90 days in jail and an arrestable offense.
So what actually happened here is that the biker was technically arrested, meaning that the search performed by the officer here was a search incidental to arrest.
Police don't need a warrant to search you after placing you under arrest.
People are also wondering about the biker not being read his Miranda rights.
Another point that people don't often understand. Police don't need to read you Miranda rights immediately after arresting you. They only need to read them if you're under arrest and they're about to interrogate you. Cue the bootlicker comments. We're just trying to explain the law.